A millionaire found a homeless woman with a baby who looked exactly like his late wife. What he discovered left him in tears. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Let's continue this amazing story. It was a bitterly cold November evening in downtown Chicago, the kind of night where the wind seemed to cut through even the thickest coat. Snow fell gently, blanketing the city in a pristine white, while the hum of traffic and distant chatter created a muffled soundtrack to the bustling streets. Alexander Moreau stepped out of his black limousine, his polished leather shoes crunching against the fresh snow. He adjusted his coat collar against the chill and glanced briefly at his reflection in the tinted car window. To the world, he was the picture of success, a self-made millionaire with the world at his feet. But behind his sharp suit and calculated demeanor, Alexander carried a loneliness so deep that even his wealth couldn't fill it. It had been 5 years since he lost Eleanor, the love of his life. Her death had carved a hole in his heart that time had failed to heal. Though he tried to bury himself in his work, attending galas and charity events to distract himself, the void remained. Tonight was no different. He had just left a charity banquet where his name had been celebrated as a top donor. Yet the applause and gratitude meant nothing as he trudged down the quiet side street, seeking solace in solitude. As he turned a corner, a faint, plaintive sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a baby's cry, carried on the wind, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. Alexander stood still, listening intently. The cry came again, more distinct this time, pulling him toward the source. His footsteps quickened, leading him into a dimly lit alley. There, against a wall streaked with graffiti, sat a woman huddled in a thin, tattered coat. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and gaunt, her arms wrapped tightly around a baby swaddled in a frayed blanket. The child squirmed and whimpered, his tiny face peeking out just enough for Alexander to see. He froze. His breath caught in his throat as a strange sensation washed over him, an inexplicable familiarity. The baby's green eyes, his soft curls, and the delicate features of his face were eerily identical to Eleanor's. It was as if she were staring back at him through this child. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the alley. The woman flinched at the sound, her grip on the baby tightening as she looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse. "We don't want any trouble." Alexander raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to harm you," he said gently. Is everything all right? Your child. He looks familiar." The woman's expression hardened, her exhaustion giving way to a protective fierceness. "He's just a baby," she said sharply. "Why are you staring at him like that?" Alexander hesitated, his mind racing. What could he say? That this baby looked like his late wife? That he felt an inexplicable pull toward a stranger and her child? Instead, he cleared his throat. "It's freezing out here," he said. "You both look like you could use some help." The woman shook her head, clutching the baby closer. "We're fine," she insisted. But the baby's soft cries grew louder, his tiny fists flailing against the cold. Alexander's heart clenched at the sound. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cashmere scarf, offering it to her. "Please," he said, his tone more urgent. "Take this. At least for the baby." The woman hesitated, eyeing him warily, before her gaze shifted to the baby. Reluctantly, she accepted the scarf, wrapping it around the child. "Thank you," she murmured, though her body remained tense. "What's his name?" Alexander asked softly, his eyes fixed on the baby. "Samuel," she said after a pause, her voice barely audible. "Samuel," Alexander repeated, the name tasting foreign yet familiar on his tongue. He knelt slightly, trying to catch a better glimpse of the child's face. The resemblance to Eleanor was uncanny, and the questions swirling in his mind threatened to overwhelm him. "Are you sure?" Before he could finish, a loud car horn blared from the street, startling them both. The woman stood abruptly, her eyes darting toward the noise as if preparing to flee. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Wait." Alexander called after her, his desperation evident. "Please let me help you." "I can." But she was already moving, her thin figure disappearing into the shadows of the city. Alexander stood there, the scarf still clutched in his hand, as the baby's cries faded into the night. He lingered in the alley for what felt like hours, his thoughts racing. Who was this woman? Why did her baby look so much like Eleanor? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? The memory of the child's green eyes burned in his mind as he finally turned and walked back to his car, the cold seeping into his bones. As the car pulled away, Alexander stared out at the snow-covered streets, his reflection staring back at him from the window. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief, a spark of curiosity, of purpose. He didn't know who Grace and Samuel were, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this mystery go unanswered. The following morning, Alexander sat at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the city skyline outside his bedroom window. The sun rose sluggishly, casting a pale light over the snow-draped city. Yet, despite the view, Alexander's thoughts were far from the gleaming towers and busy streets. His mind was consumed by the memory of the woman and her baby, Grace and Samuel. Who were they? And why did that child bear an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor? He dressed quickly, his movements uncharacteristically hurried. Normally meticulous about his morning routine, today Alexander didn't care that his tie wasn't perfectly aligned or that his jacket felt slightly off. He had one goal in mind: finding answers. When he arrived at his office, his assistant, Claire, was already waiting for him. Claire had worked for Alexander for nearly a decade, and she had grown adept at reading his moods. Today, his distracted energy didn't escape her notice. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau," she said cautiously, placing his usual coffee on the desk. "You seem preoccupied." Alexander didn't bother with pleasantries. "Claire, I need you to find someone for me." Her eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Of course. Who are we looking for?" "A woman named Grace Harper," he said, his tone clipped. "She's homeless. She has a baby, Samuel. I need to know where she is and everything about her." Claire paused, clearly taken aback. "This is unusual," she said carefully. "May I ask why?" "It's personal," Alexander replied, his voice softening slightly. "Just trust me on this." Claire studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll start with local shelters and outreach programs. It might take some time, but I'll see what I can uncover." "Thank you," Alexander said, already turning his attention to his computer. But as Claire left the room, he felt a pang of guilt for not explaining more. How could he, when he barely understood it himself? That evening, Alexander found himself back near the park where he had first encountered Grace. The city's nightlife buzzed around him, couples strolling arm in arm, street vendors hawking roasted chestnuts, but Alexander barely noticed. He retraced his steps to the alley, hoping against hope that Grace might still be there. Instead, he found only an empty space and the faint imprint of footprints in the snow. Frustrated but determined, he began asking around. The few people he approached either didn't know Grace or were unwilling to talk. Finally, he spotted an older man sitting on a bench near the park, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing. His weathered face and weary eyes suggested he'd seen more of life's hardships than most. "Excuse me," Alexander said, approaching him. "I'm looking for someone, a young woman named Grace. She has a baby." The man glanced at Alexander suspiciously. "Why are you looking for her?" "I just want to help," Alexander said earnestly. "Do you know her?" The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, I've seen her around. Quiet girl. Keeps to herself. Do you know where she might be?" Alexander pressed. The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. She moves around a lot. Last I heard, she was heading to that old shelter on 3rd and Maple. Might want to check there. Thank you, Alexander said, slipping a $50 bill into the man's hand. The man nodded in appreciation, pocketing the money before shuffling off. The shelter on 3rd and Maple was a far cry from the sleek, modern buildings Alexander was accustomed to. The brick facade was crumbling, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued but warm, with volunteers bustling about and weary faces seeking refuge for the night. Alexander approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted him. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for someone," Alexander said. "A woman named Grace Harper. She has a baby." The woman frowned slightly. "We don't usually share information about our guests." "I understand," Alexander said, pulling out his business card and placing it on the counter. "But this is important. If she's here, I need to speak with her." The woman glanced at the card, then back at Alexander. "She was here," she said reluctantly, "but she left earlier today. She didn't say where she was going." Alexander's shoulders sagged in disappointment. "Do you know anything about her? Anything that might help me find her?" The woman hesitated, then sighed. "She's been through a lot," she said softly. "She's a good mother, does everything she can for that baby, but she's scared, always looking over her shoulder. If you really want to help her, you need to be patient. She doesn't trust easily." "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice heavy with frustration and determination. He handed the woman a folded note. "If you see her again, please give her this." The woman nodded, tucking the note into her pocket. As Alexander stepped back into the cold night, the sense of urgency in his chest grew stronger. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to find Grace and Samuel. Something deeper than curiosity compelled him, something that felt like fate. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, the city lights blurring together as Alexander stared out the window. His mind replayed the moments with Grace and Samuel over and over, searching for clues he might have missed. Who was she running from? What was she hiding? And why did Samuel's face haunt him so deeply? As he entered his home, the vast emptiness of the space felt more oppressive than ever. For years, Alexander had been content to live alone, believing he had nothing left to give or gain. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to hope for. Connection. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and began typing Grace's name into every search engine and database he could access. If Claire's leads didn't pan out, he would find his own way. The questions surrounding Grace and Samuel wouldn't let him rest, and Alexander knew he wouldn't stop until he had answers. The following morning, Alexander awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, the weight of another sleepless night evident in his sluggish movements. It was Claire. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau," she said, her tone brisk but laced with hesitation. "I found something." Alexander sat up, suddenly alert. "What is it?" "I managed to dig up some records on Grace Harper," Claire explained. "It wasn't easy, but I tracked her name through a few outreach programs and shelters. She's been in and out of the system for the past year, but there's one thing that stood out." "What?" Alexander asked, his heart pounding. "She gave birth at Moreau Memorial Hospital 2 years ago," Claire said carefully. "I thought you might want to take a look at her records." Alexander's breath caught. Moreau Memorial was the hospital he'd founded in honor of Eleanor. "Send me everything you found," he said, already rising from bed. "I'll look into it myself." By the time he reached his office, Claire had emailed him the documents. Alexander opened the file, his eyes scanning the information. It confirmed what she'd said. Grace had been admitted to the hospital 2 years ago under less than ideal circumstances. The notes detailed a young woman in her late teens, homeless and malnourished, who had given birth to a healthy baby boy. But something else caught his attention, A name listed under emergency contacts, Eleanor Moreau. Alexander leaned back in his chair, the air seemingly sucked from the room. Eleanor had known Grace. She'd been involved in her life. But why had she never mentioned her? And why had she listed herself as Grace's emergency contact without telling him? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more perplexing than the last. "Claire," he called, summoning his assistant. She appeared in the doorway moments later. "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea why Eleanor would have been listed as Grace's emergency contact?" Alexander asked, pushing the file toward her. Claire glanced at the document, her brow furrowing. "No, but it's clear Eleanor went out of her way to help her. I found some additional notes about financial aid she arranged through one of her charitable funds. It seems Grace was one of her beneficiaries." Alexander stared at her. "Beneficiary? Eleanor never told me about any of this." "Eleanor was always discreet about her philanthropic efforts," Claire reminded him. "But this, it feels personal." Alexander nodded, a sense of urgency rising within him. "I need to know more. Call Dr. Marianne Ellis at the hospital. She was one of Eleanor's closest confidants. If anyone can shed light on this, it's her." That afternoon, Alexander arrived at Moreau Memorial Hospital. The familiar corridors felt different now, each step weighed down by the mystery surrounding Grace and Samuel. Dr. Ellis greeted him in her office, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Alexander," she said warmly, gesturing for him to sit. "It's been a while. What brings you here?" He didn't waste time on small talk. "I need to ask you about Eleanor," he said, "and Grace Harper." Dr. Ellis's smile faded, her demeanor shifting to something more guarded. "Grace Harper," she repeated slowly. "I remember her. She came to us in rough shape a couple of years ago. Eleanor was very insistent that we take good care of her." "Why?" Alexander asked, leaning forward. "What was their connection?" Dr. Ellis hesitated, then sighed. "Eleanor never told me the full story. She was always very private about it. But I remember her saying Grace reminded her of someone she cared about deeply. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push." Alexander's frustration mounted. "Do you have any idea why Eleanor would have been so involved with Grace? Why she would have listed herself as an emergency contact?" Dr. Ellis shook her head. "I can only speculate. But there was one thing Eleanor mentioned that stuck with me. She said Grace deserved a second chance, and that she wanted to be the one to give it to her." Leaving the hospital, Alexander's mind raced. Eleanor had clearly gone to great lengths to help Grace, but the reasons remained maddeningly out of reach. As his car wound through the city streets, a thought struck him. If Eleanor had been involved in Grace's life, then perhaps there was a paper trail he hadn't yet uncovered. He needed to go home, not to his penthouse, but to the estate he and Eleanor had shared. The Moreau estate had been left largely untouched since Eleanor's passing. Alexander entered the study, the scent of aged wood and leather filling his nostrils. It was here that Eleanor had spent countless hours writing letters, organizing charity events, and tending to her many causes. If there were answers to be found, they would be here. He began combing through the desk drawers, sifting through old papers and files. At first, it seemed fruitless. Receipts, meeting notes, and other mundane items filled the space. But then, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence, he found it. A sealed envelope addressed to him in Eleanor's handwriting. Alexander's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Alexander, if you're reading this, then you've likely found yourself at a crossroads. I hope this letter brings you clarity, though I fear it may also bring pain. There's something I never told you, something I hoped you would never need to know. Grace Harper came into my life at a time when I needed purpose. She reminded me of myself in so many ways, lost, vulnerable, but strong in ways she didn't yet realize. Helping her gave me hope, especially when I knew my time was running out. But it wasn't just about her, it was about her child. The child she now carries is a part of me, Alexander, a part of us. Please take care of them, as if they were your own. Grace and Samuel need you now more than ever, just as you may need them in ways you don't yet understand. Trust your heart, my love. It will guide you to where you're meant to be. Forever yours, Eleanor. The letter slipped from Alexander's fingers, landing softly on the desk. The weight of Eleanor's words settled over him, leaving him breathless. Samuel wasn't just any child. He was a piece of Eleanor, her final act of love and hope. And now, it was up to Alexander to honor her wishes. The air in the Moreau estate study felt heavy as Alexander sat in silence, Eleanor's letter still clutched in his trembling hands. Her words echoed in his mind, filling the vast room with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Grace and Samuel weren't just strangers in need of help. They were Eleanor's legacy, her final wish. And Alexander was determined to honor that wish, no matter what it took. After taking a moment to gather himself, he carefully folded the letter and placed it back into its envelope. He slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, as if tucking away a sacred piece of Eleanor's soul. His next step was clear. He needed to find Grace and Samuel and tell them the truth. The drive back to the city was cloaked in an eerie calm. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the streets in white, but Alexander's mind was a storm of questions and emotions. What had led Eleanor to Grace in the first place? How had she kept such a monumental secret from him? And how would Grace react when she learned that Samuel was more than just her son? He was also Eleanor's. By the time he reached his penthouse, night had fallen, and the city was aglow with twinkling lights. As he stepped into the warmth of his home, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was Claire. "Mr. Moreau," she began, her voice steady. "I have news. Grace Harper has been spotted." Alexander's pulse quickened. "Where?" "She's staying at a small motel on the outskirts of a city," Claire said. "It's not far from the train station where you last saw her." Alexander didn't hesitate. "Send me the address," he said, already grabbing his coat. "And thank you, Claire. I owe you for this." The motel was a far cry from the luxury Alexander was accustomed to. Its neon sign flickered faintly, and the building's exterior showed years of wear and neglect. He parked his car and approached the front desk, where a disinterested clerk glanced up from his phone. "I'm looking for a woman named Grace Harper," Alexander said, his tone firm but polite. "She has a baby with her." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "We don't give out guest information." Alexander reached into his pocket and placed a $100 bill on the counter. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just need to talk to her." The clerk eyed the money before nodding toward the staircase. Room 204. Alexander climbed the creaking stairs, his heart pounding with anticipation. When he reached the door to room 204, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking. The sound echoed in the narrow hallway, followed by silence. He knocked again, more insistently this time. "Who is it?" came Grace's voice, muffled and cautious. "It's Alexander Moreau," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please, Grace. I need to talk to you." There was a long pause before the sound of the chain being unlatched reached his ears. The door opened just enough for Grace to peek out, her face wary. "How did you find me?" "Grace," Alexander began, his tone imploring. "I know about Eleanor. I know everything." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she seemed frozen. Then, she opened the door fully, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. Samuel was asleep on the bed, his tiny form curled up under a threadbare blanket. "Come in," Grace said quietly, stepping aside. Inside, the room was as cold as the night outside. Grace wrapped her arms around herself as she leaned against the wall, her gaze fixed on the floor. "How much do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that Eleanor helped you," Alexander said, sitting on the edge of the single chair in the room. I know that she listed herself as your emergency contact when Samuel was born. And I know that Samuel isn't just your son. He's hers too. Grace flinched at his words, her hands tightening into fists. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't ask for her help, or for this secret to hang over me like a curse. I just wanted to give my son a better life. Alexander softened. I'm not here to blame you, Grace. I just want to understand. Eleanor meant everything to me, and now I feel like I'm seeing a side of her I never knew. Why did she choose you? Grace hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. She found me when I was at my lowest, she said. I was 17, pregnant, and living on the streets. She showed up at the shelter one day, and she saw me. Not just as another homeless girl, but as a person. She told me I deserved more than what life had thrown at me. She always had a way of seeing the best in people, Alexander said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Grace nodded, a bittersweet expression crossing her face. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it was the end of the world, but Eleanor made me believe it could be a new beginning. She helped me in ways I can never repay. And Samuel? Alexander asked gently. Did you know from the start that he was connected to her? Grace shook her head. Not at first. I didn't know about the egg donation until after he was born. She gave me a letter at the hospital, explaining everything. She said it was her way of leaving behind a piece of herself, even if she couldn't be there to see him grow up. Alexander's throat tightened as he listened. She gave you her hope, he said quietly. And now I understand why she wanted me to find you. She wanted us to take care of each other. The room fell silent, save for the soft sound of Samuel's breathing. Grace looked at Alexander, her guard slowly beginning to drop. What happens now? She asked. Alexander stood, his expression resolute. You and Samuel come with me, he said. You don't have to struggle alone anymore. Eleanor trusted me to look after you, and I won't let her down. Grace hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Why would you do that? You don't owe us anything. Alexander stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. Because Eleanor believed in you, and because I've spent too many years alone. I don't want to lose the chance to honor her memory and build something meaningful. Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she said, Okay, we'll come with you. As they prepared to leave the motel, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. Grace gathered her meager belongings while he carefully picked up Samuel, the boy, stirring slightly in his sleep. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a flicker of hope, a hope that, through Grace and Samuel, he could begin to heal the wounds left by Eleanor's absence. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he carried Samuel out into the snowy night, Alexander knew one thing for certain. They were no longer walking alone. The sun was just beginning to rise when Alexander's car pulled up to the entrance of his penthouse. The city streets were still quiet, the snow glinting in the pale morning light. Alexander stepped out of the car, carefully cradling Samuel in his arms while Grace followed, clutching a small, worn duffel bag. She hesitated at the entrance, her eyes wide as she took in the sleek glass facade of the building. You live here? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Alexander gave her a small smile. It's home, he said simply, stepping aside to hold the door open for her. Come on, let's get you both inside. The elevator ride up was silent, the soft hum of the machinery the only sound as Grace nervously clutched the strap of her bag. Samuel stirred slightly in Alexander's arms, but didn't wake. His tiny face relaxed in peaceful sleep. When the elevator doors opened, Grace's jaw dropped. The penthouse was like something out of a dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a breathtaking view of the city, sleek modern furniture perfectly arranged, and a warmth that seemed to contradict the sterile perfection. This can't be real, Grace whispered, stepping cautiously into the living room. "It's real," Alexander assured her. "And it's yours too now. For as long as you need it." Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why are you doing this? Why would you take in a stranger and her child?" Alexander set Samuel down gently on the plush couch, covering him with a soft blanket before turning to face Grace. "Because Eleanor would have wanted me to," he said. "She believed in you, Grace. And now I see why." Grace looked down, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know if I can live up to what she saw in me," she admitted. "I've spent so long just trying to survive. I don't know how to do anything else." "You don't have to figure it out alone," Alexander said firmly. "We'll take it one step at a time, for Samuel's sake, and for yours." Over the next few days, Grace and Samuel began to settle into their new lives. Alexander had arranged for a room to be set up for them, complete with a crib for Samuel and a small desk where Grace could sit and write in the journal he'd given her. It was a modest space compared to the rest of the penthouse, but to Grace, it felt like a sanctuary. At first, she kept her distance, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. She spent most of her time in the room with Samuel, only venturing out to eat or take short walks on the balcony overlooking the city. Alexander, understanding her need for space, didn't push her. Instead, he focused on creating an environment where she could feel safe. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Grace joined Alexander in the living room for the first time. He was sitting on the couch with a glass of scotch, a fire crackling in the hearth. When he saw her enter, he smiled and gestured to the seat across from him. "Join me." Grace hesitated, but eventually sat down. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the family photos on the mantel. One in particular caught her attention, a picture of Eleanor smiling brightly at the camera, her arms wrapped around Alexander. "She was beautiful," Grace said softly. "She was," Alexander agreed, his voice tinged with sadness. "She had a way of lighting up a room, of making everyone feel seen." Grace looked down at her hands. "I wish I could have known her better." "You knew her in ways I didn't," Alexander said. "She shared a part of herself with you that she kept hidden from me. And for that, I'm grateful." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this," she said. "For everything you've done for me and Samuel." "You don't have to thank me," Alexander said. "Just focus on building a life for yourself. That's all the thanks I need." The next morning, Alexander surprised Grace with a stack of paperwork. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the documents warily. "It's a starting point," Alexander said. "I looked into some programs for single mothers. There's a community college nearby with flexible classes. If you're interested, I could help you enroll." Grace stared at him, a mix of shock and gratitude on her face. "You really think I could do something like that?" "I don't just think it," Alexander said with a small smile. "I know it. You're stronger than you realize, Grace." For the first time, Grace allowed herself to believe him. She took the papers and began reading through them, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. She had spent so long surviving day to day that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream about the future. That evening, as Grace tucked Samuel into his crib, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The penthouse, once an intimidating space, now felt like a haven, and Alexander, who had started as a stranger, was slowly becoming someone she could trust. Standing by the window, she looked out at the snow-covered city below. "Thank you, Eleanor," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass, "for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." Behind her, Alexander watched silently from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't interrupt her moment, knowing that Grace was beginning to find her place, not just in his home, but in his life. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, Alexander felt that the emptiness in his heart might finally begin to heal. Grace and Samuel had brought something back into his life that he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the icy walls that surrounded Grace's heart began to thaw. Life in Alexander's penthouse felt surreal at first, like a dream she would inevitably wake from, but the steady rhythm of safety and warmth started to feel tangible. Samuel flourished in this new environment, his laughter filling the once silent halls and bringing a vibrancy Alexander hadn't felt in years. Despite the growing comfort, Grace couldn't ignore the lingering questions about Eleanor. She carried the letter Eleanor had given her, reading it late at night when Samuel slept soundly. Every word felt like a riddle, and the weight of its meaning pressed heavily on her. Why had Eleanor chosen her? What had she seen in Grace that made her believe she was worthy of such a profound gift? One evening, as Samuel played on the floor with a set of blocks Alexander had given him, Grace sat at the dining table, absently twirling her fork in her pasta. Alexander noticed her distraction and set down his glass of wine. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Grace hesitated, unsure if she should share her thoughts. Finally, she sighed and looked up at him. "It's Eleanor," she said. "I've been thinking about why she chose me, why she gave me Samuel. I can't make sense of it." Alexander leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "She didn't choose you on a whim, Grace. Eleanor saw something in you, something she believed in. But why me?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "There were so many people she could have helped. What made me so special?" Alexander paused, considering her question. "Maybe the answer isn't just about you," he said finally. "Maybe it's about all of us. What she wanted to leave behind." Grace frowned, trying to absorb his words. "What do you mean?" "She didn't just give you Samuel," Alexander said. "She gave me a chance to find purpose again, to rebuild my life after losing her. Through you and Samuel, she's still here, still making an impact." Grace nodded slowly, the truth of his words sinking in. But the conversation only deepened her resolve to uncover more about Eleanor's intentions. The next day, Grace found herself standing outside the Moreau Memorial Hospital, clutching Eleanor's letter in her hand. The building loomed above her, its modern glass facade reflecting the winter sky. She had debated whether to come here, unsure if she was ready to confront the past. But something in her heart pushed her forward. Inside, the bustling energy of the hospital surrounded her. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, their white coats fluttering as they passed. Grace approached the reception desk, her nerves evident in the way she clutched the strap of her bag. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but hurried. I'm looking for Dr. Marianne Ellis," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. The receptionist tapped at her keyboard before nodding. "She's in her office. 3rd floor, room 312. Grace thanked her and made her way to the elevator. As the doors closed, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever answers lay ahead. Dr. Ellis's office was warm and inviting, with shelves lined with medical textbooks and a scattering of personal photos on the desk. The doctor herself was a tall woman with a calm demeanor, her sharp eyes softening when she saw Grace. "Grace Harper," Dr. Ellis said, rising to greet her. "I've been expecting you." Grace blinked in surprise. "You have?" "Alexander mentioned you might come by," Dr. Ellis said, gesturing for her to sit. "He's been trying to piece together Eleanor's connection to you. I take it you have questions." Grace nodded, her hands gripping the letter tightly. "I don't understand why she chose me," she said, "or why she gave me Samuel." Dr. Ellis smiled gently. "Eleanor was a remarkable woman. She didn't make decisions lightly. When she came to me with her plan, she was clear about one thing. She wanted to help someone who truly needed a second chance. She saw that in you. But how could she be so short?" Grace asked, her voice filled with emotion. "She trusted her instincts, Dr. Ellis said. And she trusted you. She said you had a strength that reminded her of herself when she was younger, a strength she wanted to nurture. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She gave me so much, she whispered. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay her. You already are, Dr. Ellis said, by giving Samuel a loving home and a chance at a better future. As Grace left the hospital, her heart felt lighter, though the weight of responsibility remained. She returned to the penthouse, where Alexander was waiting in the living room. Samuel sat on his lap, giggling as Alexander read to him from a picture book. How did it go? Alexander asked as Grace stepped inside. She smiled faintly, sitting beside him. Dr. Ellis said Eleanor believed in me, she said. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Alexander nodded, his gaze soft. That's what Eleanor did. She saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Grace looked at Samuel, who had fallen asleep against Alexander's chest. I just hope I can live up to what she saw in me, she said quietly. You already have, Alexander said, and you will continue to. That night, Grace sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky. She held Samuel close, his soft breaths a comforting rhythm. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace, not because all her questions had been answered, but because she understood that Eleanor's faith in her was enough. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to try. In the next room, Alexander stood by the fireplace, holding Eleanor's letter. As he read it again, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Grace and Samuel weren't just Eleanor's legacy. They were his chance to rebuild, to find meaning in the wake of loss. And he wouldn't let them down. The early morning lights spilled into the penthouse, casting a golden glow across the sleek surfaces. Alexander stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee as the faint sound of Samuel's giggles echoed from the living room. The boy was playing with a set of wooden blocks, stacking them with the clumsy determination only a toddler could muster. Grace sat nearby, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, watching him with a soft smile. It was a peaceful moment, one that Alexander had begun to treasure. Yet beneath the surface, he felt the weight of a conversation he had been putting off for days. Today, he resolved, would be the day they discussed their future. Good morning, Grace said as Alexander entered the room. Her tone was lighter than usual, the guarded edge in her voice slowly fading as she grew more comfortable. Morning, Alexander replied, setting his coffee down on the table. He gestured toward the seat across from him. Do you have a minute to talk? Grace glanced at Samuel, who was happily absorbed in his game, then nodded. Sure. What's on your mind? Alexander took a deep breath, his gaze steady. I've been thinking about what comes next for you, for Samuel, and for us. Grace's brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean? I mean that I want to make sure you and Samuel have everything you need, Alexander said. But more than that, I want to help you build something lasting, a life where you don't feel like you're just surviving. Grace hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. You've already done so much for us, she said. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not, Alexander assured her. This isn't about charity, Grace. It's about family. Whether you realize it or not, you and Samuel have become a part of my life. And I want to make sure that you feel safe and supported, not just now, but in the future. The word family hung in the air, and Grace's eyes filled with tears. She looked down, trying to collect her thoughts. I've spent so long feeling like I had to do everything on my own, she admitted. Letting someone in, it's not easy. I understand, Alexander said softly, but you don't have to do this alone anymore. Eleanor believed in you, and now I do too. Whatever you want to do, whether it's going back to school, finding a job, or something else entirely, I'll be here to help. Grace nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she said, I want to believe that. I really do. Later that day, Alexander took Grace and Samuel to a nearby park. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of grass beneath the frost. Samuel ran ahead, his small boots crunching against the ground as he chased a red ball Alexander had brought along. Grace watched him with a look of pure joy, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You know," Grace said as she and Alexander walked along the path, "I used to come to a park like this when I was little. It was my escape from everything, my family, the chaos at home. For a few hours, I could pretend everything was okay." Alexander glanced at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "You've come a long way since then," he said. "And Samuel has a future filled with possibilities because of you." Grace smiled faintly. "I still feel like I have so much to learn, so much to figure out." "You will," Alexander said confidently. "And you don't have to do it all at once." As they watched Samuel tumble into a pile of leaves with a burst of laughter, Grace turned to Alexander, her expression serious. "Why are you doing this for us?" she asked. "I know Eleanor asked you to, but this feels like more than just honoring her wishes." Alexander stopped walking, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Because you've given me something I thought I'd never have again," he said. "A reason to care, a reason to hope. After Eleanor died, I felt like I was just going through the motions. But you and Samuel, you've brought life back into this house." Grace blinked, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Alexander said. "Just promise me you'll let yourself believe that you're worth this. Because you are." Over the following weeks, Grace began taking steps toward a brighter future. With Alexander's support, she enrolled in a community college program for social work, inspired by Eleanor's legacy of helping others. It was a small but significant step, one that filled her with both excitement and fear. Samuel, too, blossomed in his new environment. He and Alexander had developed a bond that warmed Grace's heart. Storytime before bed, playful games of hide and seek, and even quiet moments where Alexander would hold Samuel close, as if the boy were a part of his own soul. One evening, as Grace sat at the dining table working on an assignment, Alexander approached with a folder in hand. "I've been thinking about something," he said, placing it in front of her. Grace opened the folder, her eyes widening as she read the contents. It was a trust fund set up in Samuel's name. "Alexander, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "This isn't about me trying to take control of your life. It's about giving Samuel a foundation, something to fall back on no matter what happens." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to," Alexander replied. "Just promise me you'll use it wisely for him." Grace nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." That night, as Grace tucked Samuel into bed, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She kissed his forehead, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude for the life they were building. In the next room, Alexander sat by the fire, holding Eleanor's letter once more. He read it carefully, letting her words remind him of the promise he had made, to honor her memory by caring for Grace and Samuel as if they were his own. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Alexander felt whole. He had found a new purpose, a new family, and a renewed sense of hope. And as the fire crackled softly, he knew that the best chapters of their story were still to come. The following months were transformative for all three of them. The once silent penthouse now buzzed with life. Samuel's laughter echoed through the halls as he toddled from room to room, a constant ball of energy. Grace began to flourish as she balanced her studies and motherhood, her confidence growing with each new challenge she overcame. And Alexander, who had spent years lost in the shadows of grief, found himself renewed, his days filled with purpose and his nights no longer haunted by loneliness. It was a crisp spring morning when Grace found herself standing in the kitchen, flipping through her textbooks while Samuel played with his toy cars at the table. Alexander entered, carrying a tray of freshly brewed coffee and pastries from their favorite cafe. "You've been working hard," he said, setting the tray down in front of her. "Thought you could use a break." Grace smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thank you. I've got a big assignment due next week, and my brain feels like mush." "You're doing great," Alexander said sincerely. "I'm proud of you." Grace looked down at the coffee cup, hiding her smile. Those words carried a weight she hadn't realized she craved. After years of feeling invisible, hearing someone believe in her felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. That afternoon, Alexander took Samuel to the park while Grace stayed behind to study. Watching Samuel chase a flock of pigeons across the grass, Alexander couldn't help but smile. The boy's joy was infectious, his tiny arms flapping as he mimicked the birds. A pang of longing struck Alexander as he realized just how much he loved this child, not as a duty to Eleanor, but as his own. Samuel ran back to him, his cheeks flushed and his curly hair wild. "Look, Alex," he exclaimed, holding up a shiny rock he'd found. "That's quite the treasure," Alexander said, crouching down to examine it. "You've got a good eye." Samuel beamed, clutching the rock tightly in his small hand. "I'm gonna keep it forever." Alexander laughed softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "Forever's a long time, but I think you can manage." As they walked back home, Alexander felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. That evening, after Samuel was tucked into bed, Grace and Alexander sat together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting a warm light over the room. Grace held a photo album in her lap, flipping through the pages slowly. It was one of Eleanor's, filled with memories of her charitable work, travels, and quiet moments at home. "She was incredible," Grace said, her voice soft. "I wish I'd had the chance to thank her properly." "She would have said you already did," Alexander replied. "By living the life she wanted for you." Grace nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo of Eleanor standing in front of the Moreau Memorial Hospital. "Do you think she'd be proud of us? Of how we've come together?" Alexander smiled, his gaze distant but warm. "I think she'd be overjoyed. What we've built, this is what she wanted." Grace looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know where we'd be without you." "I could say the same about you," Alexander said. "You and Samuel have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a family." In the weeks that followed, Alexander began making plans for the future. He updated his will to include Grace and Samuel, ensuring they would always be cared for. He also established a new charity in Eleanor's name, focused on providing support to single mothers and their children, something he knew would have meant the world to her. The day of the charity's launch was bright and clear, the kind of day that felt infused with possibility. Grace stood by Alexander's side, Samuel in her arms, as he addressed the small crowd gathered outside the hospital. "Eleanor believed in the power of kindness," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She believed that even the smallest act of compassion could change someone's life. Today we honor her legacy by continuing that work, by giving others the same chance she gave Grace and Samuel." The crowd applauded, and Grace felt a swell of pride and gratitude. As Alexander stepped down from the podium, he turned to her, his expression soft. "Thank you for being here," he said. "Thank you for making it possible," Grace replied. That night, they returned to the penthouse, exhausted but happy. Samuel was already asleep, his tiny body curled up under his favorite blanket. Grace and Alexander sat on the balcony, sipping tea as they watched the city lights twinkle below. "I never thought life could be like this," Grace admitted. "Safe, stable, full of hope." "Neither did I," Alexander said, "but I'm glad we found it." Together, Grace looked at him, her expression serious. "I know I've said this before, but thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Alexander said. This is what Eleanor wanted. And it's what I want too. Grace smiled, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not just in a physical space, but in a family. As they sat together, the quiet hum of the city surrounding them, she knew they had found something rare and beautiful, a second chance. In the months that followed, life continued to blossom. Grace excelled in her studies, finding a passion for helping others that mirrored Eleanor's. Samuel grew into a curious and adventurous child, his laughter a constant reminder of the joy he brought to their lives. And Alexander, once consumed by grief, found purpose and peace in the family they had created together. Though Eleanor was no longer with them, her presence was felt in every moment of kindness, every act of love. Her legacy lived on, not just in the work she had started, but in the hearts of those she had touched. Together, Grace, Samuel, and Alexander carried that legacy forward, building a future filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.